All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
We are back. Um, Jill and Tina and I and Hod is joining us tonight to reflect on the Holy Hurt episode 4, which was called All in the Family. We had a great discussion tonight. So if any of you have any reflections you want to share, I'll do a quick summary and then we can jump in. So this episode, Dr. McBride talked about how when spiritual abuse is part of the culture that we grew up in, it can be really hard to identify because it feels so normal. It can feel confusing if our body is telling us that something's bad, but our community tells us it's good or godly. Um, so, this episode talked about what we need to develop as healthy children, like the normal development, what our human needs are, psychological, emotional, physical, and social needs, and how that when those needs aren't met, it can affect how we feel about ourselves and how much we do or do not mature as a human. And then finally, she reminded us that it's never too late to start meeting those needs for ourselves and finding people to help us meet those needs. So, if you guys have anything you would like to share, feel free.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting was she was talking about um, the way in which um, I think she was talking about our defense mechanisms, like how we communicate to other people in pain, and how often when you're raised in a religious group, there's language such as like, oh, get over it, this is God's plan, or you just have to have more faith, and how that narrative kind of connects to shame because the person then feels like, man, I'm not good enough, or I don't pray enough, or I'm not believing enough for me to get out of this pain. Um, and just the reality, again, the head experience connection that's talked so much about in there in the podcast, but the importance of being really present with people in their pain and the reality of what it feels like in the moment, and showing up for people by just sitting and listening rather than, criticizing or judging them for their suffering. Um, And I often think about the messages that I received in my own life when I was in moments of pain and, God will get you through. And so there's a part of me that believes that. I do believe that, but in the moment, what I needed was this really sucks and this hurts and we're here and we're gonna sit with you in this. So yeah, that was something that also really resonated with me when I was listening to the podcast.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of I'm a big fan, as Shannon knows, of Kate Bowler, and she writes a lot about that because she was I guess like we hear a lot about purity culture, but there's also a prosperity like a Christian prosperity movement. Like if you believe enough, you're going to be prosperous and everything's going to go well for you. And she's so this is what she was believing, and then she got really sick, like with cancer. She had a 2 year old, I think, and she thought she was going to die. Like she had, I believe it was stage 4 cancer. She was not well, and she's written a few books about it. And this past year, I was just curious a little bit about Lent because we've never practiced Lent, and she had a series that she did, Have a Great and Terrible Lent, and like and that's basically like the devotions that she would send out every day. Is like, sometimes it's okay sometimes when to say like things are not okay, and it just really it gave me a new perspective. um Even just when people are like, oh, I'm so glad that God spared me from that or whatever, it's like, well, what about the ones that God didn't spare? Or like things like that, that it even just being able to sit with those feelings and recognize like that yeah, sometimes it's just not fair. Sometimes it's not a matter that, oh, you didn't pray enough or enough people didn't pray for you or whatever. It's just, this is life. This is what happens. And, and being able to process those feelings too.
One of the things that I've learned in my own faith journey recently, I'm taking a Bible course, is also normalizing wrestling with God.
Mhm.
Like that is something that's a new concept for me. Wrestle with God? Like what? What do you mean by that? Right? Um, but those questions, Tina, that come up, like just also in the freedom and autonomy that, oh, I actually can wrestle with God. I can ask him these questions and I can ask him the whys. I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
punished for that. Um, and the freedom in that. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
like it's
I know. I think of it like, and I've heard a few people mention it recently, that hymn that we used to sing, like, we follow the faith of questions, not, that's not biblical. I mean,
mm,
even no matter what you feel about the Bible or whatever, that is nowhere in the Bible. Like, questions is, having questions is not a lack of faith.
mhm,
And I mean, if we look at the disciples, we've heard it mentioned so often, like they would ask questions and Jesus would answer with questions. Like,
mhm,
questions were never looked down upon. And you know, if you look at like even the Jewish culture, like, you know, I've read different things, like it's a big, and I don't want to make generalizations, but like debate and discussion are a big part of their culture, you know. And I feel like that's how it should be. And like, even my, for myself, like, I was talking to Tim Boris the other morning, and I said to him, like, I did such a good job of deconstructing. Like, I tore everything down, but now I'm rebuilding. And that's a lot harder, you know, like, because you, there's something, you want to be purposeful when you've been so thorough about like tearing down everything you believed. And now you want to be purposeful about it. So there are lots of questions and lots of examinings that are going on. But I feel almost like I guess this might be healing, hopefully, but like a feeling like I can get through this, and no matter where I land, that maybe the faith that I have will be stronger, because being uncertain isn't a lack of faith. Like, if anything, it's, I said this to Shannon, some other ladies in our group we have, that like it's almost like the definition of faith, right? When you have all of these doubts, where you're like, but still, I still feel like, you know, like there's something here, you know.
Yeah, Tina, as you're saying that, it's occurring to me that, this episode talked a lot about those developmental things that we maybe didn't go through when we were younger. And I think maybe that's why this reconstruction and deconstruction is so difficult, because we never constructed on our own as individuals, right? Like, we were all given a construct, a view of the world, a view of God. We were just given it to us. We weren't allowed to explore, ask questions, figure out how that related to us and our personal identity and our life. Um, and so this is the first time we're doing it. We've never done it.
Yeah.
We haven't had any practice at it. We haven't had anyone model it for us, right?
And even thinking about what you said last in our, after our last episode, that like professing at 11 years old and being expected to take part in meeting, like, you should have been like, the expectation should have been that someone would teach you,
Mhm.
not that you would be bringing something. And I'm not trying to, because I've been in meetings where I've been very touched and very, I thought that the what the little ones shared was very precious, and I don't want to take away from that. But it's just backwards.
mhm,
I was brought up to believe that um, that I didn't really deserve anything good, and if I did happen to get something good, it wasn't because that I deserved it or that I worked for it. It was just because God was being good, or just by chance. Um, and then after I had my nervous breakdown in the work, and I spent a number of years trying to figure things out, and it really was a horrible experience for me. Because if you don't believe that you are worthy of anything good, then you don't tend to look for it. And I had some disabling depression. And I remember after a gospel meeting one night, one man shook my hand and asked me how I was, and I said, "Oh, I'm okay." And he said, "What? An able-bodied, strong young man like you, just okay?" He said, "Come on."
Mm,
And
Mm.
um, I have never forgotten that because it made me feel horrible.
yeah.
Um, and that is what we have to like pull ourselves out of. Um, that what we were brought up to believe pulls us down. And as we're going through these experiences in life that are teaching us um, what we are worthy of, that are teaching us how to just act, how to be, how to live normally in a normal life. We're bombarded with all of these people, all of these um, uh, attitudes. That's the word I'm looking for. All of these attitudes that are trying to pull us down. So, it's huge, this deconstruction. It's huge. But through it all, um, as horrible as it was for me, I can look back and see that God was teaching me. Like he was bringing me through it, but it wasn't going to be an easy thing. It's not something that suddenly you just happen to know all of these things because you believe the right things now. It's something that has to be learned and has to be taught. That's just how it is.
And I think it's an ongoing process, right? Like, I don't think you feel like you've arrived yet or
No,
anything like
no,
that.
definitely not. However, life has become so much easier because I love myself.
Mm,
And that's part of loving God
yeah.
because God
Mhm.
is part of us, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
once we get to that point, then it's almost like you start to learn in leaps and bounds.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think to what you said, Hod, it's not that you can just pick up a new set of beliefs. It
Yeah.
has to be something that you experience and feel in your body, right? Like you have to learn what it feels like to feel safe. You have to learn what it feels like to feel love and to love yourself and what that feels like in your body.
That's such a good way of putting it, Shanna.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yes. I like when I had my nervous breakdown, my psychiatrist told me, as long as it took to get to where you are now at this low point, it will take you just as long to get back to being well again. So,
Mhm.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not saying that that is exactly how it goes, but I think that that is a certain amount to what we can expect. If we spend 30 years being taught a certain thing, it's going to take a long time, maybe not 30 years, but it's going to take a long time to unlearn those things.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mhm.
and getting stuck in that, like I find myself wanting to rush it along. Like, okay, I need to be at this point in my journey, or why isn't this happening for me, or why isn't something sticking? And she says that in the podcast, like you're never too old, or you're never too, what is she? Yeah, too old, too sick, too hurt to change,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Like,
Like,
even people nearing death
yeah.
can learn, can still learn, still change.
And
Did
like
she
she
call it
even,
neuroplasty?
yeah, and so much like she really emphasizes that like our bodies are wired to move forward. Like if we
Hmm.
slow down and listen to our bodies, it will tell us how to move forward. But you're right, Jill. I get impatient too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned slow down because that's kind of what it takes, right? You have to slow down first.
Yeah.
And then, like Hod said, maybe the leaps and bounds. I haven't gotten there yet, but
But when you totally understand something like grace, you've got the revelation and you're moving along, and then a week later, you realize that you're doubting it again.
Yeah,
And,
totally.
and I mean, it's yeah, I've had so many revelations about grace that it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
yeah,
You're right though, Hod. I mean, it takes the wiring in our brain, right? Like it's been so solidly wired for all of us since birth to think one way.
Mm,
So it makes sense that it will take some time to create other pathways to wire those pathways stronger than because our brain prefers to do the easy thing, right? Like those strong pathways that were wired our whole childhood, our whole adulthood up until recently.
yeah.
and then like for me, it's a bit of a different. My parents didn't profess until I was about 5, I think,
Mm.
and before that, they had a lot of marital problems, and our home was not a happy home, and that kind of stopped when they professed, you know.
Mm.
And then, so for like 7 years, things were good. Like that's how long my parents professed. And I guess like I, as the oldest, maybe I was the only one because I'm like 3 years older than my sister, 4.5 years older than my brother. So I was the only one who remembered the before. And then my parents stopped. I was 12, so my siblings were still quite young, and they never did profess or whatever. So I kept going and kept clinging to it and kept and then when I went through really like some traumatic experiences in my late teens, it was the only thing that I could think of that could bring stability, you know? So, and I remember even like, as I said, like it's been years that I've been like unraveling myself from what I believed and thinking like, wow, there, you know, like maybe this, but then always thinking like, well, but it's the only way for me, you know, like even if it's not necessarily the only way, it's the only way for me. And it took a long time to really even be able to move forward from that. So there was a whole bunch of other entanglement that I experienced that was maybe a little bit different than what the rest of you did because I
Yeah.
wasn't not fully born and raised. I feel like I was because my dad's family was really into it, and I mean when you're 5, you don't really remember a lot before that. Like most of my memories as a child, were my parents going to meeting, and even when my mom left, like she would uphold the rules for me, like you know that she wasn't going and she could do whatever she wanted. She'd be like, "Are you wearing that skirt? That skirt's too short," you know.
That makes a lot of sense, Tina. Um, yeah, it's a lot. I think learning to meet our own needs is kind of a first step. I don't know what you guys think, but that's something I'm practicing. And
Yeah, it's a big one.
yeah.
And that's part of loving ourselves, right? Um, we have to do self-care.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe that you're worthy of anything, then self-care is not important.
Yeah.
Mm,
And
yeah.
it just goes back to I love when like we read what Jesus said, like love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Like I just love that he included that
Yeah,
because I
exactly.
have realized that if I love my neighbor the way I love myself, I'm probably doing my neighbor a pretty big disservice. Like there's a lot so
That's wonderful. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
yeah,
thank
thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah,
You
you too.
too.
Bye.
Bye.
Night.